Hello, my name is Arthur Holland Michel, and I am a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. This episode of the Carnegie Council podcast is brought to you in collaboration with the Peace Research Institute Oslo as part of its Regulair project. Regulair is a multi-year research initiative about the integration of drones and other emerging technologies into everyday life. I am very excited to be joined today by Dr. Stephanie Hare. Stephanie is a researcher, broadcaster, and author focused on technology, politics, and history. She is the author of Technology is Not Neutral, a short guide to technology ethics. And if you follow the tech space with any regularity, you've likely seen her on one of the various news programs that she regularly appears on, or have read her writing in publications such as The Washington Post, The Guardian, and Wired. Stephanie joins us today from London. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So first, tell me, what would you say is the overall thesis of your work?
Ooh, I don't know if there is an overall thesis of my work, other than every now and then I find something that is motivating me enough to get off the couch or close whatever book I'm reading and take a closer look at. And there's no shortage of that when it comes to technology ethics.
Maybe I'll meet you halfway. Is there an overall theme, if you will, to the types of topics that interest you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I approach technology from a pragmatic perspective. In my book, the question I had was, how do we build technology and use it and invest in it in a way that maximizes benefits and minimizes harm? So like that was the sort of overriding thesis, if you will, for that book was is that possible? And if so, how? But I think for me, the sort of triggers, if I'm going to take a closer look, is privacy, civil liberties, human rights, particularly regarding children, women, groups that tend to be excluded from power. And obviously, then, like on the positive side, I'm really motivated by things that can make the world a better place and what the corporate governance structures looks like. I don't always assume that technology is doing something new. Oftentimes things look new, but when you look at them, they aren't, in fact, all that new. It's pretty rare. In a lot of cases, the science might be new, but not the way that the companies that are building it are doing it. So that's often just a sort of clear power grab or a pursuit of market share. But that still makes it really interesting. So if you're somebody who's interested in business, you might be studying technologies just from a business or national security perspective.
Something that is interesting to me about your work is that, within the technology space, you have a very broad sort of scope of verticals that you look at, and so I'm wondering in that sense, if in your experience, having looked at such a range of technologies through a sort of ethical lens, if all emerging technologies share a common set of ethical challenges. Is there a sort of fundamental base layer of ethical challenges that you see being kind of universal to emerging technologies, or are the challenges really sort of unique to each system, to each application, to each domain?
Hmm. That's a challenging question, because I think you have to always look at the technology that's in front of you, or the tool that's in front of you. It's going to be a product or a service or an object, and ask, what problem is this trying to solve? And the problem might be a negative problem, like it's a harm or an inconvenience and it's making something better. Or it might be there's this opportunity for us to do something that we couldn't do before. And so isn't that great? And so you kind of look at it and go, well, does it do what it says on the can? Does it solve the problem it's trying to solve? And how would I know that? So what metrics can we use to measure that and have a discussion? But then you also have to step back and go, okay, cool. It might be defining success correctly in that it's solving the problem it's trying to solve, and we have metrics, we can measure that. But is it, in doing so, creating new problems or other problems? Is it making something worse, or simply just having an impact elsewhere? And it might not be linear, right? It might be in a sort of completely non-linear way, but it's still important. So unintended consequences is probably the best way of thinking about that. But I look at it, I think I try to just look at it pretty calmly and forensically, and to go through it and also to look around it. I won't analyze a technology just head on. You might parse it through the lens of politics, economics, society, the climate, right? The climate impact is often understudied when we're looking at technology. And I don't look at it necessarily in the same way that you might get from like the perspective simply of money or investor return, return on investment, shareholder value. People who do that are going to have a really different answer as to whether or not a technology is a good thing or a bad thing versus somebody who is looking at it from a rights perspective. But what I try to do is embrace all of those different lenses in my analysis, depending on, am I doing this for a broadcast? Am I doing it for a private client that's asked me to do some assessment for them or due diligence if they're looking to invest? Or am I talking to concerned parents or teachers or children, right? So it all depends on who you're talking with and kind of what skin do they have in the game? What's their stakeholder position? And that's really different depending on who you're talking to.
That's really fascinating, Stephanie. It's almost as though it's like a formula that can be applied for determining ethical implications. And if we to dig into this notion of the formula a little bit more, I'm wondering how one sort of calculates for uncertainty, because oftentimes when a new technology is presented, it's at a very early stage. It might only be at the kind of concept stage or the prototype stage, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty about how it will actually perform, in the real world, who will use it, what kind of policies will exist around it. And so I'm wondering, in this kind of ethical calculus, how does one factor in that uncertainty, and how does that play? I mean, if we have uncertainty about say the net benefits of a technology, does that draw away from a sort of calculus of its net, its sort of ethical balance more broadly?
I mean, I think there's probably several different components to that question. So it's totally fine to release a tool in beta as long as you say it's in beta. I think where you get into trouble is if you put something out onto the market and don't tell people that, you don't manage expectations. Because then what happens, and we can come up with all sorts of examples, I'm sure, and we'll all have them in our minds as I say what I'm about to say. What will happen is investors get very excited and you can get a hype bubble. It's often really fanned by the media, which is motivated by different incentives than helping the public and protecting the public. Some journalists are doing a great job of that, but others are just looking for clicks, right? So they will be like, how can I be the newspaper or the journalist who tells a story that everyone's going to want to read? I'll hype this up and make it sound super exciting and not actually tell people, here's where this tool or technology is in its life cycle. Here are the risks. Here's the uncertainties. You would want to use this with caution. So what this does is it creates a lot of problems for companies who don't know if they need to immediately get on the bandwagon with a certain type of tool, or are they going to risk being left behind? And that could be very dangerous for their business. So they're all, having FOMO, fear of missing out. Then you get the public who starts freaking out about, what does this mean for my job? Or what does this mean for my society? How do I help my children to deal with this? Simply because everybody's gotten so burned by that. And I think particularly in the past 20 something years, that can be a real problem. And so what you end up having is, it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. So somebody introduces something, a product, a service, a tool, a technology, and then you get the aftermath, which is like all the critics pile in, and they might be journalists, but they might be academics. They might be rivals to the people who've put the product out. Or it might be that finally the regulator steps up, or the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK will put out a blog post at 5:30 in the morning on the 30th of August, which is exactly what they did about generative AI and large language models, saying these technologies are in beta. They have a lot of problems. We can't spot those problems easily, and there are no mitigations available, which is the sort of information that frankly should be on the front page of every newspaper and was not, right? So it becomes really tricky to pull all of those threads together and get them to the public in a digestible, clear, actionable way. And that is the gap that I try to fill.
The way you're talking about it, yeah, it makes me think about how in the sector, the tech sector, there is a lot of the way people speak is very confident about topics that perhaps there is less certainty than they would give on to, and I wonder if, in an idealized sense, one might even go so far as to say that there is an ethical imperative to highlight uncertainty. There is an ethical imperative when talking about these technologies to sort of be candid about what we do and do not know. Would you think would you say that's a fair characterization?
Yes, but I think it comes down to how we understand confidence. So you've highlighted on the fact that a lot of people, when they're talking about technology, they like to make these big, bold statements. And what you never do, what you never see, is people hold their hand up and say, I got that wrong. Or pointing to somebody who's speaking very confidently on television or radio or social media, acting as if they know stuff. And then if you actually were to show their track record of their calls, do they get their calls right or wrong? Right? There's no follow up. So what I'm saying is, in the marketplace of ideas, there is no penalty in the marketplace for ideas for being confident and wrong. Right? Like that, and that's a massive statement. So what I mean by that is, if you want to be first and get it right, I don't know, 5 times out of 10, you're still going to get away with that, because nobody's going to hold it against you and go, yeah, but half of your calls are completely rubbish. Whereas if you're cautious, if you're slower, if you're taking your time, you face a penalty as an analyst for doing that. You might actually have a higher batting average in terms of accurate calls, and you're speaking a more measured language. So the people who are in the know will follow you. But if you're looking for people who just want to make big, grandiose statements and they use, very sort of histrionic language, the marketplace of ideas rewards that, particularly social media.
As you say that, it also gets me thinking about how it's not only uncertainty that is often kind of glossed over in this space, but that things are often discussed also as binaries, which also does not really uh, cohere with the vocabulary of ethics, which is not so much about binaries as it is about sort of looking at those in between spaces and finding trade-offs and really trying to understand the coexistence of positives and negatives in the same space. But I want to move it on a little bit to look at the AI ethics discourse specifically. So much in the AI space has evolved so rapidly in the last few years. But I was wondering, from your perspective, if the AI ethics discourse has itself evolved. Is AI ethics discussed or acted upon differently now than it was, say, 5 years ago?
I think it's more just that people are looking for action, right? Like, it's great to have talk, but at a certain point, talk needs to evolve into action, or it just becomes irrelevant to decision makers. And that's what I think is changing, is that we have the EU AI Act potentially coming online, although we'll have an idea closer to the time, around the 6th of December. I think that's when they're doing their final vote, if we get that through or not, in the terms of this parliamentary cycle. There's very little action coming in the United States. There will be no action in terms of regulation or legislation coming from the UK. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's been very clear on that. So what we've got at the moment is like a commitment to have more summits. So a commitment to talk more. And that's important. You want to keep a dialogue going. So that's great. But if this doesn't lead to regulators being able to regulate, if it doesn't lead to empowering consumers to potentially file lawsuits and change operating models of some of these companies, then ultimately it's all just, a lot of talk.
There's been so much talk recently, as you kind of alluded to, around AI safety. There was the UK AI safety summit just a couple of weeks ago. In a way, it almost feels like AI safety has gained a profile that has sort of superseded that of AI ethics as a concept. Do you actually see that happening yourself, or and I guess if so, if the focus is in one way or another shifting from AI ethics as a concept to AI safety as a concept, what kind of material effects will you see that having on how AI is controlled?
So I think it's just really important to kind of keep ourselves grounded and ask, like, what is all of this about? So if you ask most people on the street, if you go down to your local coffee shop or your local parent teacher organization, or call your parents and ask them what's the difference between AI safety and AI ethics, they will probably shrug, and it will have no meaning to their life right now. So this is like very much an inside baseball conversation that we're having. It doesn't mean it's not important, but I just think it's important to put it into context. Most people on the planet do not care about this. And if they care about it, they want to know if it's going to take their jobs, right? Like that's the first thing I hear when I'm talking to ordinary people is just, what does this do for my job? So is that a safety thing or an ethics thing? I don't know if people would care what term you want to use. They just want to know if you're going to be, creating mass unemployment, or if this is somehow going to help them be better paid, better employed, and also what does this mean for their kids if their kids are in education or potentially going to university or making career choices. So that is something that like every political leader around the world is thinking about quite seriously is what is this technology going to be doing for employment? What's it going to be doing for productivity? What's it going to be doing for election interference? So I think I'm less interested in the sort of abstract discourse, people who go to academic conferences chat, although I love like listening to that. But my contribution to this is like keeping it real, right? For most people. So is AI safety about existential threats to humanity, or is AI safety about deep fakes being used to take little girls' pictures in school, which has been happening in several school districts around the world now, and turn them into deep fake porn? And the little girls have no protection. Their parents have no protection. The police don't even know if it's a criminal matter or not because this technology has completely eclipsed existing laws, right? It becomes that's this question of what we even mean by AI safety, which Vice President Kamala Harris of the US highlighted in her speech when she came to the UK a couple of weeks ago, is really interesting. Like existential risk for whom? What do we mean by existential risk? Are we really talking about AI as a potential, risk equivalent to nuclear war or pandemics, which is what some people have said? Or are we talking about AI destroying the fabric of society and rendering elections useless, etc.? So I just think it's important for those of us who work in this space to remember that the vast majority of people on the planet don't care about definitional arguments. They care about very practical things. How is this affecting them? And how can they protect themselves and their loved ones and use this technology for good, not for harm?
I'd be curious, from the way you describe it, it sounds like we are in perhaps a little bit of a transitional or in between stage where governments are talking seriously about guardrails and regulation, but we don't actually have anything super concrete of that nature yet in place. How you see things evolving in the years ahead, either in the way people talk about AI, or the way that institutions actually action it, with a caveat which I can sort of preempt, being that we don't know how the technology itself is going to evolve necessarily, whether it's going to continue on this same kind of pace of progress or whether it will slow down. But what are, if you will, some of your predictions in this space for the years ahead?
So I am not a great maker of predictions. I think that's a bit of a fool's game in the sense that if we had been talking last October, you wouldn't have predicted any of the stuff that's been happening in generative AI the whole past year. I wouldn't have either. And ultimately, just I'm not sure how useful it is. I think it's more a question of, are we going to be really empowering the population to understand what's at stake here? So For instance, do most people know about how AI is already shaping their lives? Right? Could they say with confidence, I know how many departments within my government are using AI already. I know the areas where it's making decisions, such as healthcare, in my bank, whether or not I get a loan or a mortgage, how it's being used in our judicial system already, how it's being used in elections, what's happening on data protection and privacy. I mean, the United States doesn't even have a federal privacy law yet, so sometimes I think we want to really run before we can even walk. And, the whole piece around child protection is massive, and we don't have an answer for that. So the question is more, are we going to either be beefing up the enforcement of existing legislation and regulation? So consumer protection, antitrust, data protection, privacy. Those are some examples just there. Or are we going to be seeing new legislation created so that regulators and consumers can take action to protect themselves? That's point one. There is an argument that you don't necessarily want to be relying on regulation. And that's where this very vague term of guardrails comes into play. So whenever you hear somebody talking about how we need guardrails around AI, ask them specifically what they mean by that. Because if it's principles and guidelines and ethics committees and the like, it doesn't work. Like, it doesn't work. We've seen that. We've watched that. So it's better than nothing. An umbrella is better than nothing in a hurricane, but it's not going to keep you dry, right? So there's just this question of, what do we mean by guardrails? And what I've been seeing is that when we use the word guardrails, we're hearing it from people who don't want new regulation. The easy way to think about it is something coming into place that would allow me to sue someone? Who can I hold liable? How can I get accountability? It's not going to be guardrails.
Yeah, as you say that, I guess one of the parts that I'm curious about, because you are speaking so much about sort of the actions that are needed to be taken, is bridging that gap, between like public awareness and actual, sort of regulatory action. I mean, it sounds like you see yourself as very much almost like an interpreter or a translator of these complex technical issues for people that maybe don't have the time to, follow this stuff as closely as we do. Does that extend to your mind to policy makers? Is part of the issue here, as others have commented, and I still don't know where I stand on this, that sort of policymakers just don't understand the technology. And so part of the work that still needs to be done is giving them a more technically accurate sense of the stakes.
I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily that policymakers don't understand it. It's not that they're busy, right? They've got a lot on their plate. We're still working through the aftermath of the pandemic. In a lot of countries, there's a cost of living crisis. We've got several wars going on around the world. Just to say, there's a lot going on. Some of them are very informed and have great teams, and others, it's not their strength or their area of interest because they're focusing on climate change or they're focusing on healthcare. And that is good. We want that. So the real question, I guess, is how do we empower not just policymakers, but also the population who elects policymakers to make sure that we've got enough people keeping an eye on all of these issues and protecting the things that we all think are important. And of course, that's going to depend. If you're living in the United States, you might have a different idea of what you think needs protecting than here in the UK or in France or, over in China, one of the great AI superpowers. They have a very different discussion around this, but that doesn't mean they don't think that things are important or that they don't have things they want to protect. They do. So it's more that. And I think that's the case around educating the general population on things like privacy, data protection, copyright, and intellectual property. If you're one of the people who's had your IP stolen in order to train large language models, if you're an actor or a writer or a musician, you're just as involved in this, if not more so, than a policymaker, because that's your work that was just stolen to make other people very, very wealthy. So what does that mean? Anybody who's trying to protect election integrity is looking at that. That's not just policymakers, right? That's just ordinary citizens. So it's journalists even. How do we make sure that our journalists are empowered to hold power to account? So I think it's like a whole system problem. I almost view it like a public health issue, because in cybersecurity, there's a saying that you're only as strong as your weakest link. And I think we all saw a nice demonstration of that during the pandemic, right? Like all you needed was for certain people to be doing certain things and you could get super spreading events. And that certain people's behavior could either contribute to the problem or help shut it down and control it. And then we got vaccines. So, how would you apply that to empowering your population to be more constructively critical and mindful and thoughtful about the role of technology and specifically AI in their personal life, in their business, and in their community?
Your point about so many of the stakeholders here just having very little time given everything that is on everyone's plate at the moment. To me, that's a problem that extends to regular citizens as well, who, have so much to deal with, and they might not share the same sense of urgency or priority around AI issues that people like you and me, who have our heads stuck in this stuff every day, certainly hold. And so, with this sense of being kind of efficient about surfacing the issues that are most critical, what would you say is the some of the ethical issues around AI that you do think we need to be focused on more? And I'm alluding perhaps directly or not so indirectly to this question of like artificial superintelligence or replacing people in their jobs, which in my opinion, and as I've written, sort of takes a lot of the oxygen out of the room for other issues. Whether you agree with that or not, what would you like to see surfaced more in the sort of mainstream discussion around AI ethics? If there is one thing around AI ethics that you feel like someone who really has a lot on their plate already should be focusing on, what perhaps would it be?
I guess I'd like to see everybody who considers themselves, if not to be an expert, then certainly active in the world of AI, to do everything that they can to help share their perspective, their research, their analysis with their community. Because I think the more people who have knowledge and skills to look at AI, the better off we're going to be. And I say that for a number of reasons. One is this question of diversity. There's a very small pool of people on the planet looking at this technology right now, and they are by no means representative. And that could be from a gender perspective, it could be from a nationality perspective, a geography perspective, all of it. So that's not great for the planet. If we're truly going to take this idea that AI is one of the most important technologies for the 21st century, it cannot be being shaped by a minority of people on the planet. That's just not healthy. So I think it's great to see it being discussed at the UN, at, different government levels and intergovernment discussions, all that high level stuff. That's great. But it should also be being discussed in your community. Go to your school, talk to small businesses about it, offer your services as much as you can, and answer the call anytime a journalist calls and says, can you come and explain something? Because we need these different points of view. Because what there is happening is a real battle of narratives, and that is often linked to people who have inside interests. They want to see certain narratives win over others, and that could be for financial gain, whatever. It's not healthy. So we want to have those different perspectives. And like as a researcher, I personally welcome that and need it. I need people to challenge me as a researcher to make sure that I'm thinking about things in a different way. So the question that you and I were just discussing earlier of like the AI discourse, ethics versus safety, is that being discussed, for instance, in China? Is that being discussed in France? Or is it like a real Anglo-Saxon English language discussion, right? Because it's really easy for all of us to be having a conversation in this way. I just wonder if we went to, Peru or Kenya and we're discussing how people there see AI and risks and opportunities, would they frame it in the same way? And that involves curiosity to be hearing what everybody else is thinking about it, what they want, what they're scared of, what their potential solutions are. I would just like to see all eyes on the prize. And some people have more information than others. So I think, with great with great power comes great responsibility, as the saying goes. If you've got the knowledge or the exposure, sharing it with the public and inviting as many people into the discussion as possible will hopefully help us get to a better outcome.
So, as I am very well aware, working in this space, in the tech space, covering technology every day can be very taxing, and it can feel like there is an overwhelming amount of grim or difficult news to process on a daily basis. And so I wanted to ask you, in closing, a question that I ask all my guests, which is, what gets you out of bed in the morning? What are you optimistic about in this area?
I don't know necessarily that I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I think I'm probably at a stage in my life where I'm like, you're here. You can either try to make a positive impact or at least be neutral. Being silent is also an option. So there are days where I don't have anything to say about a particular topic. And there's more of those days than there are the days when I feel the need to put my oar in. I guess I think a lot about, I trained as an historian, so I think a lot about the evolution of technology over time, and that there were all sorts of moments in human history, right up until the present day, where some people had to decide what they were going to do when they got out of bed. And yeah, things can feel really grim right now, but I think they've probably felt very grim at other moments in human history that we can all think of our favorite ones. And they still decided to do something amazing or just do something decent. It doesn't always have to be amazing. It could just be like a nice thing to do, a kind thing to do, a compassionate thing to do. So I sometimes feel if I don't know exactly why I'm getting out of bed, I'm like, well, why don't you just try and do something that's like okay, that's a net neutral to net good would be great. So yeah, I don't put the pressure on myself, and I also, it can be tough working in tech. I'm not going to minimize that. I know exactly what you mean about the burnout and the exhaustion and the despair, but talk to a nurse or a teacher or a doctor or a climate change scientist, and then you get a really different perspective about, there's or somebody serves in our military, right? Or just a firefighter. Like, there's all sorts of people are facing all sorts of pressure and they still have to get up every day. So I don't feel like I deserve personally any special consideration. It's my job to manage myself. If I need to go for a walk or take a night off, I do it. And look after each other, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. AI and other tech issues are not going anywhere. And just being a bit more mindful about it. What are we ultimately doing all of this for? I think, you and I are probably very aligned on the fact that we would like to see this be a net good for humanity. It's not there yet, but that's okay. Rome wasn't built in a day. This isn't either.
Patience, right? It's a rare commodity these days.
Yeah. One step at a time.
Stephanie, I really appreciate this very grounded perspective that you have. Lord knows in these days we all need it. And I'm certainly going to go to bed tonight and wake up tomorrow morning thinking about your words. So let's leave it at that. I just wanted to end by saying that I've really, really appreciated the discussion. To all our listeners, I highly encourage you to follow Stephanie's wonderful work, a rare voice of reason in this chaotic space that we operate in. And just to say that we hope we can have you back at some point, and to keep up the good work and also the occasional moments of self-care. So thanks so much, Stephanie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this Carnegie Council podcast. For more podcasts, videos, and articles exploring the most critical issues at the intersection of ethics and international affairs, please visit us at carnegiecouncil.org. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our channel on YouTube at Carnegie Council. Thank you for the privilege of your time.